Welcome to you all. My name is Khalil Shariff. I'm the CEO of Aga Khan Foundation Canada. It's a great delight to welcome you here to the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate in Ottawa. We are just steps away from this place where the three rivers meet, and for time immemorial, the indigenous people of this area, the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, gathered here not only themselves, but invited indigenous people from a very large catchment area to come every year to this area in a spirit of exchange of goods and services for sure, but also of relationships and of ideas. And so it is, of course, our great privilege to be able to carry on in some way that tradition established by our indigenous ancestors of using this space as a space of exchange, hopefully with the intent that we might have those conversations in this space and amongst us that lift our collective horizons for a more peaceful, prosperous, and pluralist world for all. And it is in that spirit I welcome you here and welcome all of those who are joining us virtually from around the world to what is a very important conversation occasioned by the launch of this year's World Bank World Development Report. This is something that happens every year, and an issue is chosen and then elaborated with research and perspective. And this year's report is on the topic of migration. It notes, I think, with clarity and with precision, a fact about our current condition, which is not altogether new, that humanity is a force on the move, that we are people on the move, for all kinds of reasons, sometimes by choice, but often quite tragically in a forced situation. And it is a situation that humanity is having to grapple with increasing urgency and in almost every corner of the world. And so today's event, our conversation today, is to look at this issue from a whole series of different perspectives. I'm delighted that we have with us today a group of people who are going to be able to shed light from many different dimensions. I want to thank especially Global Affairs Canada, who is our long-term partner in hosting these kinds of conversations. I'm particularly delighted that we have here a senior official from the World Bank who has been involved with the report. I won't scoop my partner in introducing him, except to say that the bank is, of course, a massively consequential institution for development issues around the world, not only as a knowledge actor and as a deep thinker and researcher, but also as a practitioner, often in some of the most difficult places in the world. This is where we, as the Aga Khan Development Network, often come into contact with the bank in its work in fragile and conflict-affected states, and it has always been clear to us that the bank can be an extraordinarily important agent of progress and positive development change in those settings, and very happy to be able to work with the bank in launching today's report. And I want to thank Cooperation Canada, with whom we are partnering with today's event in the most recent episode of a very long history of partnership to bring together conversations that shed light on Canada's development priorities and the issues that Canada as a development actor around the world ought to be dealing with. So we're really delighted that Cooperation Canada is here. We've got a full program ahead of us today, so I'm going to be uncharacteristically brief. I will say to you one note, which is that we're going to be using this nifty technology called Slido, which you will be able to get on your mobile phone. At some point, you'll see a QR code is going to appear on these screens, and if you either go to slido.com or put this QR code in your phone's camera, you'll be sent to that site. Put in this number, 4213021. If you're online, you can do this equally. And that's going to be the mechanism through which, at least one mechanism through which you'll be able to respond to what you're hearing and to pose questions, etc. We've had extraordinary experience in these kinds of events, and we found that there are some people who are very happy and ready to stand up and ask a question. There are many people who have many important questions to ask, who will rather not stand up and take the mic and ask it. And so this is another way to help people who are maybe not so comfortable asking questions behind a mic to offer their views and questions in that way. So a delight to have you all here, and with that very brief introduction, I'm going to ask my colleague and friend Kate Higgins, who is the CEO of Cooperation Canada, to take us to the next part of the program. Kate? Raucous applause would be appropriate.
Thank you, Khalil, for encouraging the applause. I appreciate that. So bonjour, good afternoon. It's really a privilege and a pleasure to be here with all of you in person or online for this very special event. I would really like to express my genuine gratitude and thanks to Khalil for this partnership, and to the Aga Khan Foundation of Canada for opening this incredible space to us for a very important conversation today. I am a really staunch believer in the value of research, in the value of discussion, and in the value of dialogue, and the importance of bringing global thought and practice leadership to the Canadian international development, humanitarian, and public policy spaces. We at Cooperation Canada are absolutely delighted to be partnering with the Aga Khan Foundation of Canada today to do this through the Canada launch of the 2023 World Development Report, titled Migrants, Refugees and Societies. I really hope that we can continue to find opportunities like this to connect Canadian and global expertise and best practice and experience on some of the most pressing issues of our time. Migration and refugees, the subject of this year's World Development Report, is certainly an issue set that requires deep, sustained, and engaged public policy discussion and societal attention. And I feel so privileged to be with you all this afternoon on the eve of World Refugee Day, to have an opportunity to learn from the incredible panelists and from the discussion as we think through and grapple with the challenges, but also immense opportunities that migration bring. The scale of migration and displacement today is vast and immense. The World Bank's report notes that there are 184 million migrants without citizenship worldwide, and of them, 43% live in low and middle income countries. The United Nations recently launched their Global Trends Report, where they noted that 108.4 million people globally were forcibly displaced by the end of 2022, with 76% hosted in low and middle income countries and 70% hosted in neighbouring countries. This displacement poses intense hardship and challenges on individuals, on host communities, on countries, and we must recognise this and act in a way that takes into account responsibility sharing, humanitarian principles, and human rights. Cooperation Canada members, which are made up of almost 100 Canadian international development and humanitarian assistance organisations, are actively engaged in all regions of the world in providing support and opportunities to refugees, to migrants, and displaced people around the world through their advocacy, through their programming, and through their partnerships. As I'm sure we will learn this afternoon, migration can also pose a huge opportunity, and this is an opportunity that a country like Canada has certainly benefited from. The diversity, the prosperity, the initiative that migrants bring to countries like Canada is immense and is a huge opportunity. But we need creativity, we need innovation, we need partnerships, and we need investment to unlock this. So, with that, let's get the show on the road. Let me introduce one of our very important guests this evening, we are very thrilled to have the co-director of the report, Çağlar Özden, with us today to talk to us about this 2023 World Development Report. He's a lead economist in the Development Research Group of the World Bank and received his undergraduate degrees in economics and industrial engineering from Cornell University and a PhD in economics from Stanford University. His research explores the nexus of globalization, of labour markets, of government policies and economic development. He has edited books, numerous amazing papers in leading academic journals, and his current research project explores the determinants and patterns of global labour mobility, the impacts of migrants on the destination labour market outcomes, medical brain drain, linkages between migration, trade, and foreign direct investment flows. So a fantastic person to provide substance to us all this afternoon. Please welcome Çağlar. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me here. Grateful to the Aga Khan Foundation and to Cooperation Canada and all of you. I cannot imagine a better place to talk about migration than Canada, the capital of Canada, because migration created this country, though I must admit it was very hard finding a direct flight from DC to Ottawa. So we have to do something about that. So I have a slightly hoarse throat, so I apologize, and if I'm hoping I'm not going to lose my voice. Now, okay. World Development Report. For those of you who don't know, WDR is the annual flagship publication of the World Bank, right? And the president and the chief economist pick a different topic every year. They put a team together from the bank, from different units, and we work on it slightly over a year, maybe 15 months, and it's an extremely tiring process. That's the reason why nobody ever does it again. So let me show you how it works. This is the core team. One of the most impressive things about the WDR, there are two impressive things. First, I would like you to really go to the website and open it, because at the end of June is my annual evaluation, and one of the metrics they do is how many times the report has been downloaded, right? And it's 350 pages, but almost 120 pages of it are references. We cited the hell out of this thing, right? The team read through literally hundreds of papers to construct this report, and this is the core team, to digest everything into almost around 200 pages. Now, the second most impressive thing is the acknowledgement section. It's 7 pages with literally hundreds of names, right? It is the best of what the bank offers to the world. If you look at the World Bank annual report, if anybody bothers, actually we are a bank, but we don't give that much money out. The real value of the bank is actually in terms of knowledge production, and this is one of the most impressive parts, and the team comes from all these different units with different backgrounds, training, everything, and then we put it together. Now, the third impressive thing, so you remember hundreds of papers we read, 200-page report, there's a 30-page overview, there's a 5-page press release, there's now a 20-minute presentation with 15 slides, and then there are tweets. So it is really, really important that you go read the report, because there's no way I can give full credit to all the work that the team put together. I'm here talking on their behalf, but it's been an incredible process. Two other important things. There's two external advisory boards. One of them is more the policy advisory board, so the heads of the IOM, UNHCR, ILO, prominent politicians, policymakers in both migrant sending and receiving countries are on the board. You have no idea how many consultations we had. I have no idea. We lost track. And then there's an academic advisory board, because bringing this both policy-relevant work as well as the intellectual depth, including 2 Nobel Prize winners on the academic advisory board. Right? Now, sorry, when I clear my throat, I'm going to pull back, not to blow your ears. Couple important things. There are quite a few new things in the WDR, but the purpose of the WDR is not to come here and boast. The purpose of the WDR is to pick a topic which is both important and there's no agreement on what the solutions are, right? And to provide the what we call the clients or the audience are the policymakers, right? Whether they are in high-income countries or low-income countries or international organizations or NGOs, right? How to think about the issue. So when you open the WDR, you're not going to find every country mentioned, right? We're going to pick a topic which we think is important, and we're going to give a single example to make that point, right? We're not going to say, oh, here's the migrant number by education level in every country. It's not like that. It provides a framework. The framework is how to think about the issues and how to try to find the solutions. Now, having said that, let me first mention a couple new things that, for those of you who are familiar with the migration research and the data, which might look slightly different. We define migrants as people who do not have a citizenship in the country in which they live in. Now, a lot of places, including myself, I've been at the bank for 20 years. One of the things I do is actually construct the famous, highly used bilateral migration database, is looking at the number of migrants, and it is generally defined as people who are born in a different country. Two reasons for it. One is the most important one, because that's how the data are collected. Right? But that's the easy way. The reason why we focus on citizenship is because the WDR is about the rights of the people. What determines migration, and most importantly, what determines the impact of mobility crossing a border on the migrant and on the host or the origin community, is the extent of the rights they have. Now, people who do not have citizenship cover a wide range, right? There are people, for example, like myself, I have a green card in the United States, which have a residency. I don't have to go to the military service or vote, but pretty much all my other rights are pretty secure. Then there are people who are on a visa, permanent visa. There are people who are on a temporary visa. There are people who are undocumented, right? You have the whole range. The report talks about it, but there's a significant cutoff between a person who's a citizen and who is not. That is the reason. And that, when I present the framework, I'm going to come back to the issue of the rights. Now, this is a novel thing for the World Bank, because unfortunately, most of us are economists. And these kind of soft things economists don't like to talk about because you cannot put a number on it. Right? And it's also politically sensitive, and we don't want to offend governments, so on and so forth. But it is at the heart of the issue. Having said that, 184 million migrants. But let me give you the number. The number of people who cross the border and live in a different country in which they were not born in is 285 around. So 100 million people have already been naturalized. That is a huge number. Okay? And that covers almost 50% of the people in high-income countries. It reaches almost 70% in Canada and Australia. Right? In the US, it's around 45%. In Italy and in Spain, it's around 25%. So it depends on the country, it depends on their policies, it depends on the mix of the migrants they receive. Now, of that 184 million people, 43% are in low and middle income countries, 40% are in high income countries like Canada, and 17% are in the GCC. Now, GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, they do not give citizenship to anybody, so foreign-born and foreign citizen is identical in Saudi Arabia. More or less, much more an overlap in a lot of the middle-income countries and less so in high-income. This other important number there is 37 million refugees. These are the people, we define refugees by the UNHCR, people who are registered by the UNHCR or who have applied for asylum, so on and so forth. The definitions are in the report. 3/4 of these people are in low and middle income countries, which basically means, as you are seeing there, almost 1/3 of the migrants in low and middle income countries are refugees, whereas it's only 5% or 1/8 in the high income countries. Now, this is slightly misleading because if a refugee comes to Canada, eventually they're given a visa, they become a resident, they become a citizen, because refugee status is a flawed issue. You're never permanently a refugee in Canada. but in some other countries you're permanently a refugee. That's why the number stays higher in low and middle income countries, right? Keep that in mind. The number of people with refugee status or refugee background in high income countries is significantly higher than 5%. Now, the second message of the report. I'm going to try to speak very slowly. I was allocated 20 minutes, so bear with me. The second, if you look at the data since the Second World War, the trends have been extremely stable in terms of where people come from, where they go, and what happens to them. The report argues we are at an inflection point. The things we have done, if there are policymakers in the audience, the things you have done so far in the last 60 years is no longer valid. We have around 20 years, one generation, to fix or change the things we have done to take the most advantage of migration, right? And what are those things? And we are seeing evidence of this. It used to be the case, countries were either receiving or sending countries. That's no longer true. I grew up in Turkey. Turkey was a migrant sending country. There are now more migrants in Turkey than Turkish immigrants abroad. Similar patterns in England, similar patterns in Nigeria. And I'm going to talk about what has changed. Now, quickly on, the other thing we do in the WDR, there's a huge literature, as I said, literally hundreds of papers we went through. We don't spend too much time on the things that are well established in the literature. We just give the reference and ask you that you'll be able to figure out how to find that paper or the report, right? So the fundamental determinants of migration, one is income difference, but a good proxy is actually the World Development Indicators. This is done by the UN, the World Development Index. If I put a map of the world where you take the share of the population as an immigrant, it's a very similar map, indicating people go to places where the quality of life is better, right? So North America, Western Europe, Australia, well, they take a lot of migrants. Japan is an exception, Korea is an exception because of their inherent domestic laws regarding migration, but not many people, as you'd expect, want to go to sub-Saharan Africa. So welfare differences is number one. Number two is demography. This is one of those things where we are at the inflection point. Everybody knows the top line. We use Italy as an example because we love Italy. What you are seeing today, the middle column of these countries, it's basically an inversion, right? Because of the rapid decline in fertility rate in Italy over the last 30, 40 years led to this figure you're seeing. When we get to 2050, well, the expectation is that the low fertility rate is going to continue and it's going to become more of a rectangle. But by the year 2100, if things do not change, the population in Italy is going to decline by 50%. As one of my co-directors said, Italy is going to become more of an open-air museum than the Italy we know it as today, right? The bottom line is Nigeria. This is what everybody knows, right? The standard population pyramid. Now, I think UN population division, which billions and billions of, development aid and policies are based on those projections, they underestimate the decline in fertility rates, but we expect low-income countries to maintain that pyramid. Now, the big unexpected shift is the middle group. That's Mexico. Fertility rate in Mexico is below replacement today. But Mexico is not an outlier. That is the case in India. That is the case in Turkey. That is the case in Bangladesh. That is the case in Tunisia. That is the case in almost every middle-income country. Right? There's that phrase, becoming old before becoming rich, used for China. It actually applies to pretty much every middle-income country today. In India, fertility rate declined from 6 to 2 in 60 years, in 2 generations, right, below replacement. It took over 200 years for that to happen in North America or Western Europe. Income in India went up 2.5 times in that time period, real income, purchasing power. It went up 25 times in North America. Right? Now, This has huge implications for growth rates in middle-income countries, but in terms of global migration patterns, these middle-income countries are the main sources of immigrant workers, right? It's Mexico, it's India, it is the Philippines, it is Turkey, it is Morocco. These countries, they don't have perfect education systems, but they have mandatory high school education, right? Now, another fact, I'm going to throw away a lot of facts, hopefully some of them will stick. I know much more about the US than Canada, I apologize. 2 occupations in the United States that have the highest share of immigrants. One is an engineering professor. I have 2 kids in college studying engineering, so I'm grateful. The second one are fruit pickers, right? Because that's where the demand is, either extremely high skilled or low skilled. That's the labor market. Construction, household services, restaurants, hotels, right? All the relatively low skilled. It's not in the middle skill in terms of what we expect in high income countries. But these countries, the middle income countries, are the ones providing the migrants. What is changing, what has already happened, and the world has not woken up yet, is that there are no excess labor coming from Mexico or Turkey or India necessarily. Right? There is not that demographic thing. So when the West, Italy's of the world, want to take migrants, they have to go to Nigeria. But the problem there is the education system. Right? The pull is getting bigger, the push is there, but the mismatch, the skill mismatch is also getting bigger. That is where we need to focus on. So we have a new president at the World Bank, and we were talking if he didn't ask us yet. I'm hoping he will. What the hell is the WDR about? And I would say it's all about education actually. Right? It's about the skill mismatch of the world and how the labor mobility can address the labor shortages and labor excess, but where the skills issue. So keep that in mind. We'll kind of come back to that. Now, third one is climate change. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty there. When I say that, eyes open up, right? Because we go back to the tweets, we say things because we don't have space for the second sentence. There is no uncertainty about the science of climate change, but there's a lot of uncertainty about the impact of climate change on mobility. Right? A lot of the evidence, backward-looking evidence on how climate change and mobility is linked, it's all domestic, vast majority of the mobility. So you have a drought somewhere in a country, people move to especially urban areas or other parts. We really have not had big impact, let's say all of Ghana is impacted by climate change. So we do not know how climate change is going to translate into international mobility because it's, again, an inflection point. Right? That's number 3. Now, another one is conflict and violence. I think we're going to talk quite a bit. The difference with conflict and violence, what is happening now, the last 3 big refugee events in the world, Syria, Venezuela, and Ukraine, these are middle-income countries. And the implication of a middle-income country imploding or having a war, sending millions of refugees, is very different than when it happens in a low-income country in sub-Saharan Africa. Number 1, these countries are closer to higher-income countries. Number 2, their citizens have actually more financial resources and human capital to make it in a high-income country. Right? And especially in countries like the case of Ukraine, they are in the middle of high-income countries, and there's all this political dimension. So the number of refugees skyrocketed. It was at some point 5-6 years ago, it was around 15-18 million. Now it's 37 million, right? So keep that in mind. Now, when we put all of these 4 things, income, demography, climate change, and conflict and violence, and with the color-coded stuff for my mother, so she can easily understand what we're talking about, what you notice, this is the most important figure of the WDR. Well, one of them. Right? They are almost the same maps. What this implies, all these forces are reinforcing each other. In economics, we call them endogeneity. Right? It is not because conflict leads to migration and this leads to demography leads to migration. They are all reinforcing each other. Any development policy needs to be comprehensive and address all of these simultaneously. And on top of this, forced migration, especially forced migration, is a symptom of the underlying problems. All right, now, just quickly about Canada. Canada's special, but not that special, right? Fertility rate declined below 2 a while back, right? Now, the decline in fertility is unique. I don't know if there are demographers in the audience. This is the first time in human history we are going to experience population decline, voluntary population decline. It has never happened before. It happened because of wars, because of famines, because of epidemics, disease, but not naturally, voluntarily. Now, what you're seeing, I mean, Canada declined and it's staying there, but what is different with Canada is migration, which I will come. If you look at the population pyramid, you see, actually, because of migration, thanks to migration, Canada is able to maintain its kind of a rectangular figure, more or less, right? That's actually what you want. That's what migration does. Migration does not solve your demographic problem. Migration does not solve the social security crisis or the labor market crisis. It actually provides a transition, right? And you're seeing it between 2000 and 2023 and 2050. The green and the yellow colors is the confidence intervals, right? If things go as planned in Canada, right, it's not going to be Italy, right? But it's not going to be Nigeria either. Right? Now, finally, but this is the population above age 65. This is the share of population, not the number. Right? Migration does not fully solve the problem. There are two ways to address it. One of them, and the good one, is people unfortunately will have to work longer. You cannot, I mean, all the demonstrations you see in France, it's the same people in a way who are demonstrating against the change in the retirement age and against migration, right? But this is the two sides of the same coin, right? But fortunately, in high-income countries, the nature of the jobs are moving to, high-skilled. It's not about your muscles. It's not, all this. You can still continue for a very long time, and people will have to work longer, right? Labor force participation has to stay up. All right. Now, one final thing about Canada. Canada has fantastic policies. So any Canadian I meet, whether they work for the government, they're academics or ordinary citizens, they're so proud of the immigration policy. One thing I need to admit, geography plays a big role. Nobody can walk or swim to Canada. So it is much, much easier to design, implement, and enforce a selective immigration policy. But there are other countries which have the same geographic advantage, but don't take advantage of it, right? So Canada has that natural advantage. For example, it doesn't get exposed to unwanted, unexpected, sudden refugee flows, right? Even when Canada accepts refugees, they are selected. Canada decides how many, under what conditions, so on and so forth. But Canada, to its credit, designs and implements it very well. All right. Now, I'm going to talk about the framework and how we want to change thinking about migration. I already gave hints. So the first one is when migrants go to a country, how do they fit in? What we call, in this case, it's the match. Okay? Now, match has multiple dimensions. The most important is obviously the labor market dimension. How well do you fit in? Do you have the skills needed? Are you a burden on the society? But the second one, well, do you speak English or French, right? If you're coming to Canada. If you're speaking German, it is unfortunately much, much less useful. Right? So match has all these dimensions. Match also has the dimension, are you a burden on social services, right? On education, on healthcare, on housing, okay? In terms of integration, is it easier or more difficult, right? So we put this line randomly in the middle, saying some people are a positive match, some people are a negative match. Two important points there. One is, legal status pushes you up. There's tons of evidence. The more rights you have, the better match you are. Because your rights are protected, your skills are protected, and you can take advantage of the human capital you have, right? So the more skills, the higher you are. But that doesn't mean to be a positive match, you have to be a legal resident. I'm not saying a citizen. There are large number of undocumented migrants. They are there because of the demand in the labor force, right? They're there because they're providing a service. But it also means if they were to be given legal rights, their match would even improve further. All right, so that's number one, the match. Okay, and that line is kind of, it's endogenous. It can move depending on the policies. So as you would expect, in Canada, that line is significantly lower because a significantly higher share of the migrants in Canada are a positive match. Now, the second is the motive, why people move. People move for a variety of reasons. What we're trying to say with this whole framework, the reason is we want to say it's a continuum also. That's one of the reasons, the motivations of this thing. It's not because there's this perception, especially among the people who are anti-immigration, that all migrants are the same. That is not true. Some people are literally packing their bags and running for their lives, right, in a matter of hours. Some people, like me, have the luxury of migrating with a plan and with longer time horizon. And a lot of people are somewhere in between. Where that line is, now it's a legal construct. Every country on this planet signed an agreement to take refugees. The definition of a refugee is somebody who has a legitimate fear for their safety, for their life. And the countries agreed that if somebody is determined to have that legitimate fear, we cannot send them back. We have to provide protection. It's a very simple thing. Countries, politicians say, we don't want refugees, we're going to send them back. I'm sorry. You might be able to send them back, but that goes against your international obligations. Right? I'm not talking about humanity and dignity, what makes us humans. It goes against what you signed up for. Right? Now, but there are some people who are right on this side of the line, or that side from your perspective, because they might have a legitimate fear, but that's not legally recognized in the current context. Right? We're going to come to that. Now, our brilliance as co-directors of the WDR was simply to put these together. Right? To be able to say, everybody falls somewhere on this plane, on this picture. Right? There are not only 4 quadrants, there are different combinations of people. The vast majority of the people are in that upper quadrant, upper left. Right? They're economic migrants, they provide a positive value, they did not migrate because of their fear for their lives. There are fewer people who are positive match and refugees. Albert Einstein is one of them. There are physicians and there are this and that. And there's also transition. That's, it's dynamics. People initially come, but then they learn the language or their credentials are recognized, so they move up. Vast majority of the refugees are in that bottom right quadrant. Okay? Another innovation of the WDR is to identify people in that bottom, your left quadrant. What we call the desperate migrants, distressed migrants. Okay? These are the people, they don't come to Canada, but they are the ones on the boats in the Mediterranean. They are the ones trying to swim through the Rio Grande. Right? These are the people who are so desperate because of poverty or because of other issues that they're willing to risk their lives. And thousands of them die on the way. They fall victim to the cartels, to the drug dealers, you name it, to the smugglers. They spend their life savings and they borrow to finance this. Those are the people. But because they don't have legal access to the labor markets or they don't have the necessary skills, they are a burden on the host society. So those are the distressed migrants, and they are one of the biggest challenges that the world has to face and address. Now, what do we need to do? Once we have this framework, these 4 groups, what do we have to do in terms of policy So, if you are above, right, let me go show a couple slides. For the top group, whether if you're a refugee or not, it's actually relatively simple. The destination countries have to implement policies to maximize the match, maximize the gain. Right? Those are actually very simple policies, believe it or not. These are the policies that Canada does. These are the policies that Australia does, and these are the policies that everybody should come to Ottawa and to Canberra and ask, what are you doing? Tell us. Let us do the same thing. It is very, very simple. Right? But it is based on certain insights and certain social wisdom. And right now, the challenge happens when you're below the match, right? When you're a burden on the society. For those where you cannot send them back, the problem is vast majority of the refugees are in neighboring countries, and those neighboring countries are also low and middle income countries with their own set of constraints. Since we all signed up, we have to share the burden. It is a human obligation as the world community. Okay, there are tons of rich countries which do not spend a penny on this. Okay, they spend billions of dollars on other things, but not a penny on refugees. That has to change. I don't know how to do it, to be honest. Maybe shaming and naming will work. But that's the only way out of it. The average duration of refugee status is 13 years. UNHCR budget per crisis, correct me if I'm wrong, but it is on an annual basis. You cannot address the issues of refugees on an annual budget cycle. You need long-term planning, you need burden sharing. What do we need to do about the desperate migrants? We need to reduce their numbers. There is no other way out. Now, what happens, I'm going to come back to them because that's one of the most important. Now, one of the other important things of the WDR, obviously it doesn't apply in Canada, but almost all migration patterns are determined by destination country policies, right? Almost every origin country is at best a bystander of the process. Oh, our people will go, they'll send money back, we'll complain that they're mistreated, and that'll be the end of story. That doesn't work. These are your citizens. You have obligations no matter what, where they are, right? You have to prepare them for the global labor market. You have to protect their rights when they're abroad, consular protection. You have to stay engaged with your diaspora. You have to help them when they come back. You have to maximize the development impact of migration. Philippines does it, and pretty much nobody else. Well, some others do it, but nobody does it in an integrated development framework. So the WDR puts the burden on origin countries. Destination countries, legal rights, legal access, legal pathways. It doesn't have to be citizenship. It can be temporary migration. You have to have integration policies. You have to treat people with dignity. You have to recognize their credentials. Right? All of the things that rational economic policymaking says you should do. For refugees, don't keep them in camps. Let them move. Let them move where there are jobs, where there are houses. Put their kids in school. Give them access to health care. When I joined the World Bank, we had this legendary Vice President, Gobind Nankani. In our orientation, he said, every development challenge is out of a tension between the short-term political costs and long-term economic gains. This is it. This literally is it. Short-term, yes, you give them access to healthcare, your citizens complain. But it is, trust me, way more costly in the long run. 13 years is the number that should stick in your mind. Okay? Now, what do we need to do with the distressed, desperate migrants? That's the challenge. Because they are so desperate, what they do is they either claim asylum, knowing they're not going to be eligible for it, right? Which makes then the asylum process takes 2 years, and the countries become resentful, because then you have to figure out who has a legitimate claim and who doesn't. Or they try to enter illegally, become undocumented migrants, right? As a result, they undermine the legal entry channels for both economic migrants and forced migrants. What do we have to do? We actually have to recognize the people who are closer to that line and expand the definition, the coverage of protection, because some of them are really fearful for their lives. We have to increase, okay, I'm speaking now really fast. We have to increase legal entry channels. Humane deportation has to be part of the process, not just kicking them out, mistreating them, but also it all comes out of economic development. Remember, Ireland and Italy and even Sweden were migrant-sending countries just 100 years ago, right? Turkey was a migrant-sending country 30 years ago. Things change very rapidly. We can change things, and that's pretty much 20, 30 years is the time frame we have. Now, what else we have to do? We have to move away from unilateral policies. It has to be done bilaterally, especially for the good match, positive match. Origin and destination countries have to coordinate, or transit routes where mobility involves multiple countries. We have to do that. Regional policies, right? And multilateral policies for forced migration. That's number one. I'm going to skip the financing instruments. That's the boring part. That's what the bankers do in the bank. But the other one is inclusive decision making. There are two big groups of people who are most impacted from migration and who don't have a seat at the table. Number one are the migrants and the refugees themselves, right? Because they don't have political rights. So the political system, even in high-income democratic countries, they are ignored. We have to figure out a way to get their voices heard. But the second one, believe it or not, private sector doesn't have a say. Department of Homeland Security in the United States, which designs immigration policy, does not have a single economist on the payroll. Well, I'm exaggerating, but you get the picture, right? The only countries which actually listens to the private sector, who are the employers, who are the main beneficiaries of especially economic migration, it's Australia, then it's Singapore, then it's New Zealand, then Canada a little bit, right? You have to have the people most impacted from migration, positive or negative, have a seat at the table. All right, key messages, I think I have said all of them. I'm not going to repeat it. But just to recap, we're at an inflection point. We have around 20, 30 years to fix things, whether if it's global warming or demographic change. And this is it. I mean, we know the report is not saying we should have more migrants or less migrants. It is saying we need to have better migration. Because that only then the migrants, the destination communities, and the origin communities benefit. We make the most out of this mobility, which has been what defined us as humans. And we have to do it differently, and we have to do it quickly. I think, yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Çağlar, for your presentation and really sharing all of the data and the insights about the report. So now we're going to transition into our panel discussion. And just a reminder again, we'll be using Slido to take any questions from the audience, so be it from the presentation that we just had or from the discussions that we're about to have. So if you have not already pulled Slido up on your device, I welcome you to scan the QR code or use the link that will be available for those who are joining online. And now just to introduce our speakers for the panel. So I will start off by introducing our moderator, who is Daniel Rubenson. He is a professor of political science at Toronto Metropolitan University and an incoming executive director of Evidence in Governance and Politics. So please help me to welcome to the stage Daniel. Following Daniel, I will welcome back the report's author, Çağlar, back to the stage. And subsequently, I would like to invite Sylvie Bédard, who is the Director General, Central America and the Caribbean at Global Affairs Canada. Next, I would like to invite Maiwand Rahyab, who is the founder and CEO of Resilient Societies. Next, I would invite Rima from UNHCR. She is a representative here in Canada. And last but not the least, I would like to invite Lara Dyer, who is Canada's director at Talent Beyond Boundaries. So now I'll hand it over to Daniel to moderate the panel. And like I said, if any questions come up while the discussion is going on, please use slido.com and we'll come back to the Q&A after the discussion.
Great. Oh, this is on. Okay, good. Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for coming, and to the Aga Khan Foundation for hosting us, and to Çağlar for presenting this really thought-provoking and informative report. I'm sure you've all read all of the 350 pages, including the 120 pages of references. But the presentation did an amazing job, I think, of summarizing the work, which is an art in doing that. So we have a great panel, and I think we should just jump right in with some questions. I have some questions, and if there are audience questions, those can come up on Slido, I think. I have my own device here, so if I'm looking at that, I'm not checking Twitter, I'm checking Slido. So let me start by asking Rima, and maybe starting with a sort of a somewhat positive, perhaps, hopefully not self-congratulatory as a here in Canada comment, though I'm actually an immigrant, not a, well, I guess I was a migrant, now I'm an immigrant, not Canadian, so I can't be self-congratulatory on this. But so, you know, Canada is considered a world leader in refugee resettlement. I think for the last few years, very large numbers, larger numbers than any other country of refugees have been resettled here. After the pandemic, you know, a huge increase again in people being resettled, and so in your opinion, and you know, as a representative of UNHCR here, what makes Canada a leader on this? What is Canada doing well? What can Canada do better?
So first of all, I work for the United Nations and not for the government of Canada.
Yes.
So I'm going to share some facts and figures, and I'm going to try and situate Canada in the broader global perspective. Indeed, Canada has done a remarkable job in resettling large numbers of refugees to the country. For the fourth year running now, Canada has been the highest in terms of receiving refugees. Now that sounds wonderful. That figure is close to the 50,000 mark for last year. But in fact, the numbers of people in the world who are forcibly displaced far outpace anything that we have available in terms of solutions. So you heard from my colleagues, 108 million people who are forcibly displaced, about 36, 37 million of those are refugees around the world. But resettlement places are offered to a very tiny proportion. If you think 37 million, what we as UNHCR have to do is then distill that figure and try and prioritize among those populations who is the most at risk, who is the most vulnerable. Last year we did that, and we arrived at a figure at about 1.4 million people. And we went to resettlement countries, which only number something in the order of 24 globally. Despite, as Çağlar said, we have over 145 signatories to the UN Refugee Convention, only 24 countries around the world actually accept resettled refugees. So when you take that 1.4 million who are in dire need, and you consider that Canada took almost 50,000 last year, it really is a solution that is only ever going to be available for a very small proportion of people. So unfortunately, other member states have not kept pace. And we saw for many years running, the US had opted out of resettlement almost entirely. They're now coming back into that space and offering some welcome measures. But then we have to counterbalance that, unfortunately, with the state of asylum and the right to asylum around the world, and perhaps we'll have an opportunity to talk a bit about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think that your answer sort of dovetails quite well and nicely, unfortunately, into some. I mean, we saw in Çağlar's report some of the biggest displacement issues or situations in the world include Venezuela, of course, currently, where we have millions and millions of people who are being, who are refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, and so on. And so, if I turn to Sylvie, who does work for the Canadian government, one of the conclusions of Çağlar's report, or one of the points that's stressed, is the success of settling people who come to places like Canada largely has to do with our policies here, right? And so, thinking specifically about Venezuela and about Canada's approach to that, what are some of the things that Canada is doing to support that massive amount of I mean, again, of course, we can't accept. We're not accepting 7 million people from Venezuela. But what are some of the highlights of that?
Yes. So recognizing that over 80% of the migrants from Venezuela have chosen to migrate in neighboring countries of their region, we work a lot with countries of the region, and we listen to them a lot. And I had the opportunity to be Canada's ambassador to Ecuador over the last 4 years. So I was there at the beginning of the Quito process, where Ecuador gathered countries from the region to say, listen, we have this migration wave. What is it that we can do to support migrants who were either in transit or who chose to live in those new countries. And it was a tremendous effort from countries in the region to establish new policies and to really take stock of what is it that was needed in terms of support for those migrants. So, our role was to listen and to adapt our international assistance programming to what we were hearing from the region. One example in particular at that time, a few years back, was how can we work with the World Bank, GCFF, Global Concessional Fund Facility that had been established as a follow-up to the Syrian refugee crisis to support countries with innovative public policies for facilitating them welcoming migrants in their country. So how could we work with bringing that facility to the Americas region and encourage countries to establish innovative and progressive policies? And that worked extremely well because it allowed us to provide a little bit of advice, counsel to the countries, the recipient countries in the region who led actually in organizing regularization policies. We can think of Colombia, more recently Ecuador did that, and they did that with support from the international community, including Canada, but facilitated with this concessional funding that would be provided to them to help establish those more progressive mechanisms in their countries. And I have to say that in that regard, the region of the Americas can be quoted as a model in hosting migrants from their brother country. Venezuela, and sometimes this is not underlined enough, but they actually did quite well. More recently, as this crisis continues, Canada has hosted now hosted or co-hosted, including with our friends from UNHCR, 4 solidarity conferences to attract more funding to the issue of migration in the Americas region. And in that work, I was listening very attentively to the report, and we have brought in more the private sector in those kinds of efforts. We tried also to bring in more non-traditional partners to bringing more funding to this issue, but also to encourage more countries to participate in the settlement effort. So trying to innovate so that we can better and more effectively assist this migration trend.
Yeah, just as a follow-up comment to that, one of the things we're working on at EGAP is a large multi-site evaluation of how language acquisition, or not language acquisition, but language skills acquisitions, I guess, can facilitate integration. And I would imagine that the Caribbean and Latin America has a built-in advantage there, given that people generally will speak the language in the country that they will arrive in, which in many other parts of the world is not the case and a major barrier, I would imagine. So speaking of skills, Lara, as Director of Talent Beyond Boundaries here in Canada, so one of the things that stood out for me, of course, in the report is this match and motive framework, right? And so what resonates with you there in terms of sort of skills building, skills matching, and so on? What do you take from that?
Yeah, thanks for that. I love this model, and it really just gave me a lot of vocabulary around what we do every day at Talent Beyond Boundaries. We have the privilege of implementing a Government of Canada program called the Economic Mobility Pathways Pilot. I was a director responsible for the EMPP in the Government of Canada, and I loved it so much that I quit my government job to do this work, because I really think that when you look at the scope and scale of the migration crisis right now in the world, we need new solutions, we need innovation, and so this is very much a partnership with the UNHCR and with other colleagues, and it is a model that is working and that really does look at making that match. I would say that Talent Beyond Boundaries works in the upper right-hand quadrant, if you remember. So we are definitely serving refugees, but we are looking to make those really strong matches with the labor market here in Canada. And so we start with the employer. And then we go into a database that we have that has over 65,000 displaced people that have registered with us wanting support to move on the basis of their skills. And we help to make those connections. And so for me, the model presented reflects first and foremost that people move for a variety of reasons. So they may be moving because of a particular motive, but they do want to find that good match. And there was lots of references in the report about how successful newcomers are, because they typically move to a country where there's high potential for making a good match, for example. Definitely from a destination country, we want to be taking advantage of those opportunities as well. And so the work that my organization does is definitely additional to traditional humanitarian resettlement, and we support the need for those programs as well. But in Canada, we are looking at taking advantage of economic immigration spaces within the Levels Plan as well, and opening up access for refugees that have the skills that Canadian employers are looking for. And that was definitely part of the model today as well. So people move for a variety of reasons. We are looking at trying to give access to regular migration pathways so that those people don't have to endure the suffering that so often comes with irregular migration. And from the clients that we work with, the candidates that we work with, they want to be recognized for their skills. So even if they need some kind of humanitarian assistance and support, eventually they want to restart their career and take the upgrading or training that they need to kind of, come back to where they were before they had to flee. And I think that's the final point that I wanted to highlight is just this idea of training and training in the host countries, because that's something that we are looking at is how can we leverage training that is happening in the host countries so that it can either benefit individuals who want local economic integration or for immigration purposes. And I see that as complementary, and we don't need to there's no tension there. If people are getting the skills that they need for economic integration domestically, that's great. And for those who wish to take advantage of international migration opportunities, it's also a win.
Great. I want to bring Çağlar back in. I think, so when I was thinking about this and reading about this match and motive framework, something that really resonated with me was, as you pointed out in the talk today, the importance of really bringing in stakeholders more, including the private sector in the hosting country, which is something that I don't think is talked about, very much. But there's a tension there as well, right? In that, so we make these matches, which might be quite short, short term, or not short term, but a short horizon. It makes me think of the famous Henry Ford quote about, where he says, "If I would have asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse." Nobody really knows what the next really big thing is. Like the iPhone, nobody was clamoring for the iPhone when it was invented, but now we're all holding them. And so there is a tension there, but I guess the key is to try to make these matches as early as possible, and then things will flourish.
I can speak for hours, so I have to choose. And I already spoke
You
to
can't speak for, they have control over the mic over there.
I know. Look, at the end of the day, the real gains of migration happen in the long run.
Yeah.
Right? That's what we have to recognize. I migrated, but the real beneficiaries of migration are most likely my children. I mean, I benefited greatly, but it's my children. And the society, the American society, is also benefit definitely more from my children than me. Right? So in that perspective, you have to, don't think of match as a short-term thing, right? We have to bring people, but we have to give them all the opportunities and all the rights so that everybody moves up and to the west corner, right? So what the report is saying at the end of the day, and it's not just about the match, but the whole purpose of migration policy, whether if it is unilateral, whether if it is bilateral, regional, or multilateral, is to put everybody up and to the west, so that people move out of not necessity, not out of desperation, but out of desire, right? Because of an opportunity. And then where they go, they contribute the most, and the host community realizes this, and they welcome them, right? It is not easy, but it is not rocket science either, right? This is not coming up with the iPhone. This is way, way simpler than that. We have examples of it. We know how it is done. The thing why in my personal opinion, why we are at a really difficult time now, there are all these other forces that are messing with the global economy, right? And then the migration becomes a victim of all the other frustrations that arise from economic troubles, right? For whatever reasons, migrants become the victims of this process. It has always been like this in history. It is happening now, and we have to figure out how we get out of this cycle, or we kind of realize migrants are not the reasons of all the economic problems we were facing, especially in high-income countries.
Great. Thank you. Yeah?
Can I just build on that? Yeah,
absolutely.
there's only one thing that I take issue with in the report, and I'll do it with humor. But there's a comment that migration reform is a political process. And I totally understand where that's coming from. I do think by including employers, though, we add a dimension in that exists sort of outside of the political process per se. And it's a way of having demonstrating the results of the labor market impact that can then be fed back into the political process. And what I mean by that is when employers start to engage with labor mobility, they have a powerful voice in saying, these are skills that are in demand here. These are skills that we want, and so please let them come. And then that is becomes a catalyst for breaking down the policy barriers and the legal barriers that restrict people from coming. So just a very simple example, under the EMPP, so Canada's model for refugee labor mobility, if you don't have a valid passport, you can't migrate as a permanent resident. So the EMPP gives a workaround for that, because as everyone in the room knows, if you had to flee in the middle of the night and didn't think to grab your passport, or it's expired and you have no way of going back to your country of origin to have it renewed, then even though you have the most sought after skills in Canada or somewhere else, you just can't move. And so when employers kind of have that voice and can say, those are skills that we recognize and that are in chronic shortage here in Canada, that does provide an input to the political process that can be really helpful.
Great. So, Maiwand, there are a lot of researchers, myself included, who sit around in our university offices researching, trying to come up with evidence about how to reduce discrimination, xenophobia, violence against migrants and the displaced, and so on. But I think what's more important, perhaps, is to hear from people like you who have some personal experience of going through this process. So can you share some of your experience of coming to Canada from Afghanistan? And yeah.
Sure. Thank you. I think the challenges just highlighted, Daniel, I think they're, depending on where you're coming from, which country are you, like the countries of transit, where you spend time until you get to the countries of destination, you do face a lot of challenges. And in my case, particularly, I think we were, speaking of match and motive, I think I was particularly in a position where I didn't have to go through a lot of the challenges that most of the refugees do experience. I spent a year in Turkey, but still I did not sort of registered as a refugee, because that would have then sort of affected my ability to work, as well as my ability to travel within Turkey, for example. If you're a refugee in Turkey, the government decides where you're settled, and even if you travel out of that particular city, you have to get a permission. So because of that, I didn't have to go through that. But a lot of my friends, they are going through a lot of that kind of policy level issues. And then we had to, our Turkish permit got expired, and just a couple of hours before that we were supposed to become stateless. We were able to get visas and go to Georgia, spend another 9 months in Georgia as, I was with a short-term visa until we were able to come to Canada. But how can we, address these issues? How can we, minimize sort of the impacts of xenophobia and misinformation and disinformation and frankly speaking, hate against migrants and refugees? I think there are a couple of things that can be done. One, I think it's about narratives. There's so much, I think, disinformation and misinformation around the negative impacts of, as the report highlights, the negative impacts of migration and refugees and displacements in the host countries, and as a result of that, that creates unnecessary reactions. I think what can be done in countries like Canada, for example, being a leader in sort of resettlement and accepting refugees, we need to do more to ensure that we create a narrative, as the report highlights, and with a lot of authority, with numbers, that in fact the refugees and migrants are a force for good, for prosperity, for development. I think that is something that that's not. I think a lot of education has to be done in Canada, but most importantly in other countries like that are transit countries or countries, middle-income countries. The second thing I wanted to highlight, I think we need to not look at migration and refugees only from a labor economic perspective. I think the report kind of focuses more, I think, on this side of the quadrant where, so we're trying to match the skills of the refugees with the needs of the market. But I think another way of looking at it is also from the human rights and humanitarian perspective, but also in terms of how important are those values, for example, to Canada as an example. When we talk about Canada here, I mean, my own experience, I came here 6 months ago, and all the emails for example, I get, all the WhatsApp messages I get from the resettlement agencies is all about, okay, there's the job fair, if you want to go and, learn these new skills and all of that. It's all economic focus. It's all about, how we can be integrated into the Canadian sort of economic sector. Similarly, if you look at the news and media here, when they highlight stories of migrants, it's mainly about small businesses that they have created. That's kind of the big story. I think the other part that's really missing and we have not invested in is people like myself, people who are, let's say, civil society advocates, human rights defenders, people because of the sort of the backsliding in democracy, because of the closing civic spaces, a lot of people have no chance but to leave their countries. And there are people who are well established in their countries, and they are, and the values that they fight for there are the same that Canada sort of believes in and stands for. So, for me, we need to see how we can, what matches that, how can we bring that skills, value that, and into the Canadian society, and by supporting them, by giving those kind of people that doesn't necessarily have those economic skill set with them, but if we can help them to engage in let's say, in the Canadian civil society, in the Canadian political life, and also to help them reorganize and remobilize and potentially be able to give back to their countries of origin. When the space opens up there, they have the skill set and the networks and the motivation to give back. I think that's something that we're missing. I think that's something that particularly Canada, given its global recognition as a leader in human rights and diversity, pluralism, I think that's where we need to look at that match as well and see how we can support this particular group of refugees that we're going to see more of them, unfortunately, because of the global trends that we are seeing now. We need to see how we can also invest in those. And the last thing, and this is just, we need to avoid politicization of refugees. I think in my region of the world, and for example, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, you see that the issue for migrants and refugees are always used as a political tool to pressure. For example, whenever the Pakistan and Afghanistan they have issues, then even those refugees that have a status from UNHCR, they have their permits and all of that, they are kicked out of collected from the streets and kicked out back to Afghanistan to put pressure on the country. So that's another thing that we need to look at as how we can make life easier in countries that are in transit or in countries that are in the region.
Great. I think we should bring in some audience questions as well. I have many here on my iPhone, my faster horse. Yes. Well, why don't we? Yeah, we have people.
Did you have any consultation with UN Security Council? Because it seems when you spoke about fragility, whether it is conflict or is it the climate, isn't that one of the solutions that has to be considered in order to reduce the number of immigrants? Thank you.
So, I didn't exactly. Is it on? Yeah.
Yep.
I didn't exactly understand the question. I apologize. We did not consult the UN Security Council because they are not a counterpart to us, right? They are not, I don't know the legal political term, but we don't have the right to consult with them because of the framework. But the issue at the end of the day is you are absolutely right. As I mean, I'll keep on, I'm going to sound like a broken record. Migration, especially forced migration or desperate migration, is a symptom of the underlying problems. Unless you fix them, it will always happen, right? And by trying to put a pressure, trying to stop it, does not solve the problem. It actually explodes with a bigger force later on and becomes a bigger problem. And all the problems you are saying, like we're seeing what leads to forced migration, whether it's climate or conflict or violence or economic desperation, poverty, the only solution is development. It's economic development. There's no other way. Unfortunately, economic development does not happen overnight. Right? It does happen. It can, I mean, my great uncle went to Korea during the Korean War, and look at where Korea is today. I mean, and that's not a very long time frame. We know what humanity and humans can achieve. It's just a matter of putting the will and the resources to it. But unfortunately, during that time period, during that time frame, forced migration happens, and it is our collective responsibility. That's what we signed up for, to address it.
So I think a quick follow-up question from somewhere on Slido here, which has to do with this time horizon. You had mentioned 30 years in your presentation, and the question is, why do we only have 30 years to address this migration challenge, and sort of what if we don't?
Well, I'm going to be retired in 20, so I want the social security system to be. No, just kidding. It's mainly the demographics.
Yes.
That's number one, and given the climate change trends. That's why we have around 20 years. That's what we're saying. Obviously, it can be longer, it can be shorter, but there is time, but it is not an infinite amount of time, and that's the message.
Yes.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. It's been very informative, and to the panel. I have a comment, not a question. This is looking at your quadrant on the top left. You mentioned remittances. I think this needs to be emphasized. Now, I admit I haven't read the report. It may well be. But I think this needs to be emphasized very well because many countries in the developing world today are depending on remittances. And it is a World Bank figure. Just a year before COVID broke in, remittances began to outpace ODA. And I think that needs to be brought up, that this is a very strong flow of development finance in the developing world. And that is the migrants. Right. Thank you.
Should I answer it?
Yeah,
Or
I think anybody on the...
No, you are absolutely right. We have a whole section on remittances, and if I didn't emphasize it, I apologize. The numbers are big, and it is not for every country, but for many countries, it's a significant part of their GDP. The beauty of remittances, in my view, you don't give the money to the government, which tend to waste the money. In many cases, it's private transfers. I trust my, wife or father to spend it better if I'm sending money. But the most important thing when it comes to remittances is the cost. In this day and age, it is unacceptable and fathomable that some people have to pay 10% fees. There are remittance corridors between US and Mexico where the fee is negative, right? The bank in Mexico want you to send it so you can have in a formal channel, right? I do not understand how governments can live with, origin country governments can live with 3, 5, 10% remittance fees. It is at best just they don't care. At worst, it's somebody's taking advantage of monopoly power. And these are poor people sending hard-earned money. This is one of the things when we said origin countries, what they have to do. I think the number 2, 3, 4, and 5 is lower remittance costs.
Does anyone else want to? Sylvie, I see you nodding enthusiastically.
I am nodding because I agree with that. But, you know, one of the reflections that we're having as well in terms of Canadian government is how can, through our activities in the origin countries, how can we support the families receiving remittances to invest them in sustainable small and medium-sized enterprises or other contributions that can further develop economic opportunities in the origin countries to help with the root causes of migration over the long term, right? So that's part of the circular reflection that we are having to build on the opportunity created with remittances.
My name is Elena Alvarado, and I am from Between Two Wars. My question is, in this economic development that you are working to integrate the refugees, are you considering the I don't know the word in English, but in French is reconnaissance de développement professionnel et de l'expérience des réfugiés? Because I know that here in Ottawa, there are at least 10 or 12 physicians specialized in heart problems or in kidney problems or psychiatrists that we need a lot nowadays, and they cannot work. They have to redo studies to work as nurses. And their first job is pulling the beds in the hospitals. And what happened with these people? They are discouraged. They begin to depress. Then it's not just the work, the labor. It's not the labor and put in contact the entrepreneurs with the refugees. It's also to recognize, thank you very much, recognize the experience and the training that they have. That happens most in the case of refugees or the economic migrants. Then please do something with the colegios professional schools, because they don't want medical doctors, engineers. They don't want that the foreign people can be recognized here. No? Thank you. Sorry for my passion about this.
Anyone want to comment on that?
I'll just quickly say you're absolutely right. I mean, skills recognition, I mentioned it, is critical. If that wasn't the case, Albert Einstein would be driving a taxi cab, right? But the US was smart enough to recognize his credentials. Medical profession is the most regulated profession in the world, pretty much in every country. And as a policymaker, you're facing a challenge. Especially higher income countries have higher standards, higher training. So they're saying, on one hand, rightly so, well, they don't have the same training standards as we do. But on the other hand, there is also monopolist instincts to keep out the competition. Where is the balance, right? And that requires slightly nuanced and sophisticated thinking. And sometimes we go this way, sometimes we go that way. But you're absolutely right. It's one of those things that needs critical attention.
Yeah, I would totally agree that that's another huge issue. So TBB we operate in Canada, in the UK, and Australia, and the US as destination countries. In healthcare, we are bringing in a lot of healthcare professionals as personal support workers because that is the occupational code that has the least barriers to bring folks in. But we are bringing in doctors and we are bringing in nurses as personal support workers, and then trying to help them connect to the credentialing system in the province or territory that they're part of so that they can get back up. A recent example of ours, not so recent anymore, but it took her 3 years. And so there's a video of her, Diala, on our website. And so we congratulate her and are so happy with her success. I would just say, to contrast, in the UK, our program there is doing the same thing, bringing people in bringing nurses with 3 or 4 year bachelor's degrees in as personal support workers. And then within as little as 12 weeks, with some upgrading and some on-the-job observation, that kind of thing, they're able to go back up into a nursing category. And so I know that our public health standards in Canada are similar to those in the UK, and so we are definitely trying to work with all of those credentialing bodies to say, hey, maybe there's a middle ground there. I would just say it's not just healthcare, we're seeing it in skilled trades just as much. So there's a lot of skills that are represented in displaced talent abroad that we are not going to be able to fully capitalize on in Canada unless there's more partnership around that point. So merci de l'avoir soulevé.
Thank you for the presentation. It's very compelling. Would you comment on the involvement of the private sector? I 100% agree that if the private sector is not engaged either in immigration or refugees, you're missing an opportunity. The private sector has, over the last 30 years or more, in my experience, engaged in an approach to immigration, which is globalization and offshoring of labor. So jobs are sent from Canada to countries where the labor costs are lower. This transfers economic benefit to those countries. It's also viewed as exploitive, and it's also viewed nationally in Canada as undesirable because it's sending Canadian jobs to foreign lands. That's more perception than reality in my observation, but I'd like the panel's thoughts on it.
That's a very deep. Is it on? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's.
I think you just turned it off.
Oh, this is on. Okay. No. That's a very deep conversation. The one metric you have to look at in all of these policies: what is the unemployment rate and what's the average wage growth, right? Canada, if that were the case, and the same thing with the US or any other European country, if you're shipping millions of jobs, we would have 50% unemployment rate. We do not, right? What happens is when you're, two things. When you ship the jobs, all those jobs you're referring, the quality of the jobs here change. People shift to other jobs. And the flexibility of the social welfare system and the labor market forces people to improve their human capital and go to better jobs, especially their children. So that's number one. But the number two, what we're forgetting in this whole process is the consumer benefits, right? When this microphone is manufactured in Vietnam instead of Canada, it's at a cheaper cost. So Aga Khan Foundation buys it at a cheaper price and benefits, right? This consumer surplus, it is invisible, but it is as real as the wages themselves. Now, I have 3 children. My wife is a professor. And the sole reason we are able to maintain 2 careers and have 3 kids is because we have Negasi at home. She's an Ethiopian political refugee who's been living with us for now 15 years. My wife was an engineering professor, had no idea in the sense. I mean, she knew, she was grateful to Negasi. But when I talk about it, this is what it does. You wouldn't, she started thanking her in her papers so that she could spend the time at work because Negasi takes care of the house, right? She is the consumer, she is the private sector in this case. So when Negasi is citizenship interview came. My wife went and advocated for her, saying, look, not only she's a fantastic human being, but as an American, I'm benefiting greatly from her presence in the country, right? Of course, Negasi got the citizenship she was going to get anyway. But the issue is when private sectors speak, it does make a difference. One last example. In the United States, there's a cap on H-1B visas. These are the high-skilled visas. 70,000 people. But you do know academics are exempt from it, right? And the simple reason is why they're exempt from this quota is because state governors, as the employers of professors at state universities, went and lobbied for it 25 years ago, right? Private sector, the employer, you can change policy because they knew they were going to benefit from it. It's simple as that. The reason why Canada has such open trade policy is because Canadian exporters fight the import interests and saying, look, if we lower our trade barriers, our partners lower, so we get to export as well, and Canadian economy as a whole gains from it. It's the same thing. Unfortunately, in migration, private sector, for social, cultural, political reasons, is surprisingly quiet, although they have so much to gain from it.
Can I just jump in there? So I think that this is a really important point, and I think if this is really going to shift, then it's going to be driven by the private sector. And so again, TBB's policy is that this needs to be driven by the private sector because that's what is going to really help it scale globally. So we have basically two categories of ways that people want to work with us. One is areas of chronic labor shortage, and the second is in the kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion bucket, if you will. And if this concept of refugee labor mobility stays within diversity, equity, and inclusion, it will always stay small. So we really need employers to come out in force and help us say, we need these people, we need their skills, so that it becomes part of the regular migration system. Just, I see that we're short on time, but all of the programs that I was responsible for when I was at Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada had a geographic component to it because something like 85% of newcomers go to Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. And so that leaves a whole bunch of communities without the labor that they need to grow and to develop and to keep their economies strong. And so, you know, there's a real mismatch there. There's a real opportunity. And if you missed it, in case you missed it, on June the 12th, the Government of Canada launched a new, kind of new and improved version of the Economic Mobility Pathways pilot that is very facilitative and wonderful and exactly what the private sector and NGOs like ours asked for. And so I do congratulate the government for creating the opportunity, but really it's got to be the private sector coming forward, offering the jobs to refugees to make it work.
Okay, I think we are, as you said, we are out of time, and it's a great sign of a great panel and thought-provoking report when we have far more questions than we have time to answer them, but hopefully afterwards there will be a little bit of time. And so now I think I would invite all of us to step down and invite Khalil to come up.
Well, thank you very much. A big applause to the panel. We are brimming with issues, but not with time, I'm afraid. But I do thank the panel for their comments. We have gone in many directions. Some we have pursued with vigor. Some we have just left untouched, frankly. And I wanted to invite Nurjehan Mawani to help us make sense of it all. Mrs. Mawani is singularly qualified for this. I'm not going to go through a comprehensive list of the reasons why, but I did want to touch on two or three things. Many of you will know Mrs. Mawani as a groundbreaking chair of the Canada's Immigration and Refugee Board in the 1990s. She's also had very senior diplomatic roles with the Aga Khan Development Network in countries like Kyrgyzstan and most recently Afghanistan. She's a senior fellow at Massey College. She is a governor of the International Development Research Center. She is now recently a rapporteur with the International Association of Refugee and Migration Judges, working specifically on climate migration and protection pathways. But Nurjehan was also present at the creation of one of the most interesting institutions that grew out of a partnership between the Aga Khan Development Network and the Government of Canada, which is the Global Center for Pluralism. And Nurjehan was with us when this idea was being first germinated and developed. And I raise it now because, of course, we've talked about with vigor today the role of migration as a path toward thriving economies. We can also talk about the role of migration as a pathway to thriving pluralist and diverse democracies. And of course, we need to think about all these things as we reflect on the issues that are presented in the report and confront us now as a global community. So let me ask Nurjehan now to conclude this discussion with a few thoughts from that very, very important career. Nurjehan.
Thank you, Khalil. I thought you did a pretty good job at pulling together a lot of the key elements from today's discussion, and also taking us to perhaps the question around the tremendous opportunity that is presented by Canada's multicultural and pluralistic democracy, which hasn't happened on its own. It's been very much a policy direction, and I think that so we need to once again come back to the role that governments can play, and the role that private sector can play, and also the role that civil society can play. So I think that those are so. I've just gone right into it, but when you're doing a closing, I think, and in interest of time, I don't want to leave everything to the end, but to start by thanking the Aga Khan Foundation Canada, thanking Corporation Canada, and for putting this panel together. And of course, Chela, thank you so much for the report, which is actually the one that has provoked this very stimulating, but I would submit an inspiring conversation. I mean, I have to say, in looking at the report and in the conversations, this is going to help us, I believe, in turning, if we do it right, the narrative, which is about migrants and refugees being a burden, to a force for prosperity. And I've been reflecting on how one might do that, because, you know, we are all here, we've got a number of people here who will be taking this, but how do we get this message out there? We've talked about xenophobia. We know there has been an increase. Maiwand, you were referring to that, Khalil. We know that there's been an increase in hate crimes, in hate activity, including in this country, and racism, discrimination. So we know that that's one track that's going. So, and that has an impact on the way in which Canadians look at migration, migrants, immigrants, refugees. So if I may share with you one example. When I was living in Vancouver in the 80s, we found that, I mean, property prices had started to go up. And immediately it was, oh, it has to be the Asians who are coming in. And I mean, the media, the Vancouver Sun, was one that led this charge, which was not very helpful. And then we decided, I was part of an institution called the Laurier Institution. And the Laurier Institution really believes in promoting dialogue, but based on research. That's where research comes in. Kate, I was so pleased that your shout out to research as well, IDRC research. And so this report, when it came out, the research by an economist, well known, actually pointed out that it was not the Asian migration that was doing it. It was migration from Europe and migration from mostly within Canada. Now, we had this report, so what do you do with that? We needed to find ways, so we organized roundtables. I'm saying this because we had this conversation earlier, that take this message out. We have to work with this, take it out, particularly to places where there is a lot more cynicism, skepticism about the importance of migrants, importance even of refugees. Why not? And so if we could do something along those lines, and we are all ready to support this, we did change that conversation. That was important. We went to meet with the Vancouver Sun, the very paper that had been so negative, and that changed too. We began to see editorials that changed. So the importance of taking what is really this report and getting it out there. So then the second point, I think, is that we are, the match. I think, again, that's important. Obviously, we know the role of private sector, so this is not about trying to summarize what you've said and what so many what was some very important comments that were made. But I think that, to me, the framework is a very important one. And then an integrated approach, a whole of society approach, which I know Gillian Triggs from the UNHCR was recommending recently also. So everybody is engaged in this. The whole community will need to be engaged, and voices at the table. Those who need to be there, who have been lived experience. It was good to see Maiwand here from that, bringing in that lived experience. And then you said that we need to bring, everybody seems to be in agreement that private sector needs to be at the table, much more at the table. So then why isn't it happening, or is it happening? I think from what we are seeing, it is beginning to happen. Talent beyond borders, again, you've highlighted that point as well, and you're working with, and I know that World Education Services is doing the same. So maybe, in a concrete way, my suggestion would be that we start to take this conversation forward, and that will, and then have these, try to change this narrative. Changing behavior will only happen once you start changing narrative, and we need to build more support for migrants and for refugees, because that's not going to go away. In fact, it's going to increase. So maybe because it's world, and I know I'm sensitive to the time, so it's not going to be possible to touch on everything everybody has said. There were some good examples, some positive things that are happening, but because we are on the cusp of International Refugee Day, and from our backgrounds, and there's so many people online and in here who have been refugees, and I was thinking of perhaps touching on that today we need to recognize, as we mark International Refugee Day, the incredible resilience, the incredible resourcefulness of refugees. So many who are forcibly displaced. They have not chosen this path. And we forget that sometimes, and I think that's important. And maybe to leave you with something that is happening. We talked about Canada as a global leader, but what I wanted to highlight today is how local communities are now taking a very hands-on approach. And I'd like to give you an example and a shout out to the city of Moncton in New Brunswick. What they've done is they've got an event now, and they've started Jumpstart Refugee Talent, a little bit like the Talent Beyond Borders. And this Jumpstart Refugee Talent is happening in Moncton, and under the stewardship of, I think, the Refugee Jobs Agenda Roundtable. And who is involved in this? I mean, the whole community is involved, private sector is involved, and it's this and what I think I found when I looked at it is that Moncton Metro is a leader in resettling newcomers. But Moncton is also, interestingly, the fastest growing metropolis in Canada now. And it is totally, almost totally based on immigration. So again, that is about stories. And I think that takes us to how do you take reports and how do you start telling more stories? Because that is what ultimately touches people. And it's this positive aspect. And so I'm going to leave you with that thought as a tribute to refugees and a recognition on this important day and for the work of UNHCR. And we've had an incredible partnership the whole time with UNHCR. And Khalil, on the work that the Aga Khan Development Network does in development, we've talked about this today, and stabilizing fragile contexts. That's going to be critical as we need to work on that part of it, the push factor that I think we've talked about. So on that, I'm conscious of the time, and thank you very much for the opportunity. And I see so many people in this room that I recognize and who have done amazing things in resettlement and in getting refugees out. Mike Malloy, thank you.
After a very stimulating conversation like Nurjehan just mentioned, I'd like to bring us into the formal close of today's event. Just before we head out of this space, I'd like to invite everyone to please give us some response as to how today's event went. So we'll have a QR code that's going to pop up on the screen shortly. If you can please share your feedback with us. We'd like to hear from you. We'd like to hear your thoughts, your perspectives, other suggestions, recommendations as we continue to push out a series of events here at AKFC. And speaking of events, we do have something else coming up later this week. Specifically on Thursday, we'll be having an event as part of our climate change resilience and adaptation series. We'll be talking about biodiversity positive nature-based solutions. There's also going to be attached to that a community of practice that will be led by Global Affairs Canada. So if this is within your wheelhouse or someone that you know or within your organization, please I invite you to register or follow us on our social media so that you know where you can register and sign up for the event. And with that, I'd like to say a very big thank you to all of our speakers who have made it here in person. I believe this is one of our few events where we've had all of our speakers in person in the room. So I think the group that has been with us here in Ottawa, you're a very fortunate bunch, to say the least. So please don't be in a hurry to leave out. You can feel free to continue the conversation as the formal part ends. Thank you so much.